I'm just waiting a few seconds to see if I can give a chance to one of our panelists to join before we start. She's having issues with her WebEx. But it's already 1 p.m. Geneva time, and even though attendees are still joining, I think we start the event on time, colleagues. I have your authorization, Karine. So let's now officially launch this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, welcome to this new Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogue, a series of events that we have launched before, and I see that my camera is not on, a series of events that we have launched before the adoption 2 years ago of a historic resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution in Geneva and beyond is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that we will refer to as IUCN, the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, also known as TESS, the University of Geneva, and the governments of Norway and of Switzerland. This Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution is meeting for its 5th session at the end of next month in Busan, in the Republic of Korea. The Road to Busan event series, organized as part of the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues in collaboration with various partners, provides member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for the upcoming negotiation by launching new reports and initiatives and hosting briefings and discussions for a timely outcome of this very important negotiation. Today's dialogue will discuss biodiversity in the future Global Plastics Treaty and was prepared with IUCN, the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, Fauna&Flora, and the Zoological Society of London. We would also like to thank the Gallifrey Foundation and Sierra Leone for joining today's panel. Before we begin, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made as usual available on the webpage of this event. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. There's a slide showing you how you can access this Q&A box. We will use these to feed our discussion during actually the Q&A session that we have as part of this event. The transcript is also available in 100 languages, as indicated in a new slide. So today's event doesn't have a formal moderator. After each intervention, our leading experts will be passing the baton to the next expert. And to formally welcome you and introduce you to the topic of our discussion, I am delighted now to give the floor to Ms. Karine Sigwart, Senior Policy Advisor within IUCN, leading the plastics work at INC. Karine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you also, Jen, the Geneva Environment Network, to support negotiators, but also observers, stakeholders, and many people during this intersessional work ahead of INC 5. Without your support, I think we couldn't have these dialogues, which are really crucial for the process. So thank you so much, Jen. On behalf of IUCN and its World Commission on Environmental Law, but also on behalf of Fauna&Flora and the Zoological Society of London, two really active members also from IUCN, we'd like to welcome you to this event today, talking about or discussing about biodiversity within the future Global Plastics Treaty. Just ahead of the Conference of the Parties for the Biodiversity, but also the Climate Conference of the Parties and the Desertification Conference of the Parties ahead in the next month, we, the conveners of these webinars, we're thinking about how a future global plastics treaty could fit in the ongoing discussions on biodiversity, climate change, and desertification, and also how a future plastics treaty could serve to tackle the triple planetary crisis that we are facing actually. And this is given also our mandate from IUCN, and one particular interest is also how a future plastic treaty could be aligned with the Convention on Biological Diversity, and especially also with the Global Biodiversity Framework. With this regard, Fauna&Flora, the Zoological Society of London, and IUCN developed a brief where we analyzed different options how biodiversity could be addressed in a future plastics treaty in a more particular and coherent manner in order to be aligned with the other multilateral environmental agreements. We are really happy to present this brief within a webinar with a tremendous panel. And it's important to have a look on biodiversity and plastic pollution, not only with a silo view and narrow biodiversity only, or pollution on the other side only, but also with an angle how biodiversity matters for climate change, for oceans, for disaster risk reductions, and many other obligations and challenges we are facing. You find here the link to the brief. And it's now my honor to open the panel with our next speaker. It's Dr. Alexandra Harrington from the World Commission on Environmental Law, who will give you some insights on these different options that we identified for the Future Plastics Treaty to address biodiversity and nature-based circular economy approaches, but also how communities could be better integrated in a future implementation of the plastics treaty. So Alexandra, please go ahead and give our insights from a legal perspective.
Thank you so very much, Corinne, and I would just like to echo the sentiment Corinne has already expressed of thanking Jen, thanking all of our partners, ZSL and Fauna&Flora as well. It's been a lovely process to be here, and we're very glad to share this with you. This is very much a continuation, I should point out, of the previous work that we had done before INC4 as well. So some of you may recall our intervention then and our discussion then on biodiversity. So we are happy to present the following three options. Next slide, please. So we have three options set out in the brief that would allow for legally, and then also in the future from a policy perspective and a science policy especially perspective, the method of ensuring that biodiversity is included in the application and the implementation of the plastics treaty, as well as within the actual core terms of the treaty itself. And so we start with option one, and option one looks currently at the compilation document. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you will, of course, recall that it is a very large document and it is heavily bracketed, and it has a number of different options. And within those options, it is quite clear that there are many references to biodiversity. There are many references to ecosystems and to the protection and preservation of various types of natural resources that are critical for not only meeting other, for example, CBD or UNFCCC climate commitments, but also for addressing the way back, the path back from plastic pollution and its impacts into providing for thriving communities and for communities that are very much in the process of renewal and in the process of being able to come back from the impacts of climate issues, of biodiversity issues and loss, and of course of plastic pollution. So with that in mind, our option one idea is to again stress the need for including these terms as they are proposed in the compilation document in the final iteration of the international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, also known as the ILBI for ease of reference and also for ease of time. And the compilation document, just to remind again everyone quite quickly, is reflective of the outcome of INC4 in Ottawa in April. And it was requested by and mandated by the INC process and the countries participating in it at the end of Ottawa, with the idea that it would form at least some of the negotiation basis for our INC5 discussions in Busan, which are coming up quite quickly. And these reference points for biodiversity are quite critical for several reasons. They keep the discussion on biodiversity going. They keep the presence of biodiversity and the understanding that biodiversity is indeed tied to plastic pollution, and especially to the impacts of plastic pollution, which is, of course, quite critical. But from a legal perspective as well, there are several other key points to maintaining the references that are currently in the compilation document and to ensuring that they are actually in the final text. And the first is that by doing so, addressing biodiversity will be done in a way that is consistent with other multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, that have cross-cutting obligations. And this would allow for state parties to the ILBI and the overall negotiating process to then ensure that we have regime convergence, we have obligations under multiple treaty regimes that are reinforcing of each other. They are not in any way conflicting with each other, and they can be used to work together towards a common goal, in this case, the protection and preservation of biodiversity and preventing biodiversity loss. So this very much would be allowed under the current textual proposals, which do have a place for biodiversity across the treaty. It also would ensure, and this is quite critical, and it's something that you'll hear about in each iteration of these options, that the Conference of the Parties, the future Conference of the Parties, that we assume based on all of the current drafts and proposals made for the ILBI, will occur and will be created as the governing system for the ILBI when it is implemented, as is the case for other multilateral environmental agreements, will have the ability to address biodiversity throughout the implementation process. And we have seen a number of other treaty regimes taking up this mantle and doing this throughout recent years. And as is reflected in the brief, and as is reflected in our policy discussions and our legal discussions, we can see this in a number of related multilateral environmental agreements. So we see links, especially with the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, and the Minamata Convention, the Convention on Migratory Species, UNFCCC, etc. So there is already a very strong precedent in international law and practice for establishing authority for Conference of the Parties to then work in a variety of different topic areas that relate to the overall scope of the treaty itself, including biodiversity. And this would be, of course, quite clearly important for plastic pollution. Next slide, please. Now, some examples, and in the brief, you will see that we have actually a whole annex devoted to the current references to biodiversity within the treaty text as it stands, the proposed treaty text in the compilation document. But some critical areas include the actual preambular text itself, as well as the objectives and scope. And while the preambular text is not legally binding, it has, of course, great precedent in other treaty settings for being used to create entirely new organic discussions of very critical issues. For example, we see that the idea of just transition, which is in the preamble to the Paris Agreement, has been used to create a very dedicated network and work stream within the UNFCCC system, following the adoption of the Paris Agreement, even without the presence within the text. And other things include objective and scope, where again, we see the importance of this coming in. Next slide, please. Thank you. Option 2 is, again, we can think of these very much as nesting, so keeping preferably the biodiversity language in the treaty itself as it is currently proposed in the compilation document, and then expanding on part 4.5 of the compilation document, if you're reading it, on international cooperation, so that it includes specific references to the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Global Biodiversity Framework within the articulated entities and other treaty regimes that we would anticipate and that the COP and the Secretariat would be authorized to interact with throughout the lifespans. And this would again allow the Conference of the Parties to create a much further and broader and deeper understanding of where the intersections are, and being able to then authorize work in biodiversity for the internal functioning of implementing the ILBI, as well as being able to then step over into having different coordination aspects with other treaty regimes, which will be, of course, quite critical in the coming years. And this also would include the idea of coordinating with international organizations as well. Next slide, please. And we can move on to the next slide because this is very much already covered. Finally, in terms of option 3, this would be a much more aspirational option, and it certainly builds on the idea of including both options 1 and option 2. And this would be a dedicated biodiversity article, tentatively proposed to be part 4.8. It would be part 4.8 TER, so after the current health aspects element of the compilation document. And this proposed text would ensure that we have legal and scientific connections between plastic pollution, circular economy, and innovation across all aspects of the plastics life cycle, and that this also takes into account the protection of biodiversity that is rooted in existing international law obligations, which have been undertaken by the vast majority of state parties, who most likely would be state parties to the ILBI, as well as being reflected in national laws themselves. Next slide, please. Now, we have on the text here itself, the proposed textual article. I won't go through, for the interest of time, all aspects of it, but certainly it is there, it is available. And it does aim to address both the science and the legal aspects of implementing the biodiversity elements that are found necessarily in topics related to plastic pollution and what we envision to be in the ILBI itself. Next slide, please. Thank you. It also addresses things like risk assessment and reporting, and would again facilitate the idea of intergovernmental organization exchanges and exchanges with other stakeholders as well as with other treaty regimes. Next slide, please. And so finally, to conclude, the ideas that we are presenting here as options for ensuring that biodiversity is maintained as a presence in the ILBI, and that it is as strong as possible to allow for treaty regime convergence and to allow for the maintenance of the importance of international law's relationship with biodiversity, include aspects that would facilitate future COP decisions, as well as creating space in the text itself, and that would allow for the Secretariat and other MEAs also to interact with those that are relevant actors in the biodiversity sphere. For this reason, we truly do recommend, and the brief strongly suggests, that at the very minimum, the ILBI in the future contain the option 1 elements of the treaty text as it currently is proposed in the compilation document relating to biodiversity, and then that we would hope could be expanded outwards through the elements presented in options 2 and 3. Thank you very much, and I am now very privileged to be able to hand over the baton to our partners from Fauna&Flora, and to Falco Martin, who is Program Officer for Marine Plastics at Fauna&Flora. Falco, thank you.
Hi all, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the very insightful presentation, Alexandra. And a big thanks today to the Geneva Environmental Network for having us. So My presentation will be complementary to the one Alexandra just delivered. I will be covering some of the scientific evidence that highlights why biodiversity matters and why is it essential to not overlook it in the Plastics Treaty. Next slide, please. So to begin, I thought it would be interesting to highlight the impact and connection that plastics have on the triple planetary crisis that we're currently living. Plastic pollution is a pervasive transboundary issue, as you know, with presence and accumulation recorded in all environments spanning land and sea. The exponential increase in the volume of plastic produced each year, the intentional addition of toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulating chemicals during plastic production, and the multiple sources and pathways for plastic to get into the natural environment have culminated in plastic pollution exceeding safe planetary boundaries. Overproduction, poor design, and unsustainable linear economies for plastics, coupled with limited end-of-life recapture and processing, have all contributed to the crisis, which threatens the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The United Nations and its environmental program acknowledge that humanity is confronting a triple planetary crisis with undeniable evidence of human activities negatively impacting the planet. For those who don't know, the triple planetary crisis refers to the three major interconnected challenges humanity is currently confronting, namely climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. Each of these problems stems from different causes and has distinct impacts, and all must be addressed to ensure a sustainable future on Earth. Plastic pollution of all scales is a major driver within the triple planetary crisis. As illustrated on the infographic, plastic causes pollution. Plastic pollute air, land, and water throughout their entire life cycle, starting from the extraction of raw materials like fossil fuels and bio-based sources. This process releases greenhouse gases, chemicals, and other pollutants. And as plastic are produced, transported, used, and disposed of, microplastics, chemicals, and other harmful substances are continually released into the environment. This widespread pollution affects both environmental and human health through multiple exposure routes and have been described by researchers all over the world. Furthermore, plastics are closely linked to climate change, since 99% of them are made from fossil fuels and their production is highly energy intensive. The scientific literature showed that in 2015, plastic accounted for 4.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and this share is expected to grow if plastic production increases. Greenhouse gas emissions occurs at every stage of the plastic life cycle, from raw material extraction to production, transportation, and waste management. As highlighted on the graphic here, most emission happens during the production stage. And additionally to that, plastics may also affect climate through indirect mechanisms by influencing biogeochemical cycles and impacting albedo, for example. Plastics also impact biodiversity. The scientific literature has shown that exposure to and ingestion of plastic pollution has severely impacted the health and resilience of over 2,000 species and vital ecosystems. Physical impacts of plastics include, for example, smothering of seagrass beds, damage to coral reefs and other ecosystems, which are essential to have thriving biodiversity. Furthermore, ingestion of plastic by organisms have a known broad range of knock-on impacts, such as reduced energy stores, which may account for reduced growth and fertility, reproductive impairment, reduced mobility, and weakened immune systems that can result in species death. Entanglement and suffocation of marine species by a plethora of plastic debris, including single-use items on fishing gear, also represent a major threat to biodiversity. In addition, plastic have impact on the chemical level as well. Indeed, all plastic are inherently toxic because of the additive they contain. These toxic chemicals are known to leach to the environment and to species ingesting microplastics. Further, in aquatic ecosystems, plastic adsorb persistent background toxic chemicals present in the environment onto their surface. And when these particles interact with or are eaten by species, the toxins, chemicals, and bacteria in and on plastic can potentially be transferred to the organisms, contaminating food web and potentially humans. Science has shown that the physical and chemical impact of plastic are severely threatening species and ecosystems. Biodiversity protection at the international and national levels requires inclusion of language in the Plastic Treaty that ensures a full life cycle approach is taken to address the physical and chemical impact of plastic pollution, including alternatives and substitutes, and that drives a reduction in primary production rather than focusing solely on downstream waste management measures. We believe at Fauna&Flora that it is crucial that the treaty protects biodiversity by keeping language in each of the relevant provisions, as highlighted by Alexandra in her presentation. That will ensure that the implementation does not have negative trade-offs to biodiversity. Biodiversity loss is accelerating at an alarming rate, emphasizing the need for the plastic treaty to incorporate language which will protect biodiversity to bridge gaps and create synergies with other treaties and agreements on plastic pollution and its impact on biodiversity and local communities. We need international law to be flexible and adaptable to current and future challenges. Specifically, legal and regulatory measures to combating plastic pollution, like the treaty, must address biodiversity loss, plastic pollution, and climate change together. Next slide, please. Now let's dive into why the protection of biodiversity via the treaty is important for communities. As I've just explained, the health, resilience, and productivity of vital coastal and marine habitats, such as coral reef ecosystems, seagrass mats, and mangrove forests, is significantly reduced by the presence and accumulation of all plastics. Plastic pollution affects ecosystem resilience to climate change, jeopardizing human health, livelihoods, and global economies, as well as furthering all impacts of the triple planetary crisis previously described. Marginalized communities dependent on healthy ecosystems are disproportionately impacted by the effect of plastic pollution. Indeed, the communities that are most reliant on healthy ecosystems and thriving biodiversity, especially indigenous people and local communities, are often disproportionately impacted by the effect of plastic pollution. And this is something that is reflected in the communities that Fauna&Flora work with across all continents. Our partners often see the detrimental impact from plastic pollution on their local biodiversity, which they depend on. Plastic pollution affects these communities' livelihood by impacting key economic sectors like fishing, for example, with a decrease in fish stocks and contamination of organisms, which local communities depend on for their food consumption, putting at risk their food security and the community members' health. The tourism sector is also impacted negatively by plastic pollution, with beaches covered in plastic or microplastics, like plastic pellet, for example, which acts as a deterrent to tourists and which the treaty has a unique opportunity to tackle globally. Therefore, communities we work with are calling for upstream solutions following the waste hierarchy principles to eliminate the drivers of plastic pollution and to reduce the flow of plastics into the environment, as the current pollution levels jeopardizes the right of communities to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. As described by Alexandra in her presentation, aligning the plastics treaty and existing multilateral environment agreements will promote convergence and coherence in international legal frameworks and better governance to address biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, and poverty. It is necessary that the plastic treaty enhances safeguarding, protecting, and restoring biodiversity impacted by plastic pollution. In addition to this, the plastics treaty must ensure equitable development and implementation. As we know, diverse contexts hold their unique challenges, which must be considered when designing locally appropriate solutions. Collaboration between developed and developing countries, specifically the communities disproportionately affected by plastic pollution, is crucial to ensure commitment are responding to impacts on local communities. It is imperative that the core obligation and the implementation mechanisms are fit for purpose in different socioeconomic contexts. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is it for me. I hope that you found this interesting. Thanks a lot. And please let me know if you have any question. I will now give the floor to Tobias Kappel, Marine Plastics Program Manager at the St. Helena National Trust, who will be joining us through a pre-recorded video message and providing us with an overview of the work they're doing to addressing plastic pollution on St. Helena. Over to you, Tobias.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Tobias Capel, and I'm the Marine Plastics Project Manager at the St. Helena National Trust, working on the South Atlantic Plastics Project. And I'm here to give you a short presentation about what the UN Global Plastics Treaty means for somewhere like St. Helena. To do this, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to St. Helena, for those of you who are unfamiliar. I'm then going to outline some of the key plastic challenges faced by the island. And lastly, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the kind of key achievements from our project that align with what the treaty is trying to achieve. And then also kind of outline what the treaty could do for St. Helena. So first of all, where is St. Helena? So St. Helena is an island in the South Atlantic Ocean. The nearest landmass to the island is its sister island, Ascension, to the northwest, approximately 800 miles away. It is about 1,200 miles from the coast of Africa and 2,500 miles from the coast of Brazil, so fairly remote. It is a UK overseas territory, and it is home to just under 4,000 residents as of July this year. It is recognized internationally for being home to very important biodiversity, including several hundred endemic species. And it's also worth outlining that in 2016, its entire exclusive economic zone was designated as an IUCN Category 6, so that's a sustainable use, MPA, under the umbrella of the Bluebelt Programme. And in addition, the island has designated 14 national conservation areas to protect its biodiversity. And like many other small island states, St. Helena faces very similar challenges, including geographical remoteness, dependency on imports, having a narrow economy, and a lack of human and financial resources. And in the case of St. Helena, it is also reliant on UK financial aid. So with respect to plastic-related challenges, St. Helena is obviously downstream of systemic market solutions, obviously having a very small export market, and having a small economy limits its influence on upstream actors to make those systemic changes. In addition, the cost of ethical consumerism is exacerbated by the cost of importation, the high cost of living, and the relatively low incomes faced by residents on the island. We also face challenges with effective plastic waste management due to obviously there being very limited economies of scale for plastic recycling for a population of less than 4,000 people. And to give you some more context, currently a proportion of plastic is being segregated from mixed waste streams, and that plastic is then baled to be used as buns in the landfill site, which you can see pictured here. And this is done to kind of address or reduce the volume that those plastics require in the landfill site, and also reduce the demand on Earth, which obviously being a relatively small island, both of those are challenges which need addressing. There are also economic barriers for the exportation of waste, because we obviously have to face the cost of processing plastics, the cost of shipping plastics, and the relatively low value that recycled plastics have. And lastly, another key challenge that we face is, like many small island states, is the fact that we're impacted disproportionately by international plastic pollution that's carried on ocean currents. So St. Helena sits in the face of the Benguela Current in the South Atlantic, and two pictures that you see here kind of outline some of the key problems. So that first picture on the black sandy beach, all those colorful and white particles that you can see are actually hard plastic fragments and nurdles that wash up in their thousands on that beach. And the next picture shows you Powell's Valley, again on the south coast, where you can see hundreds of single-use plastic bottles, amongst other debris, washing up very regularly on St. Helena. So as I mentioned, St. Helena is obviously actively working to address some of these kind of key issues through the South Atlantic Plastics Project. And I'm just going to give you an overview of our 4 objectives. So the first is we wanted to perform what we call single-use plastic system mapping. So obviously we know that single-use plastic items are the most problematic products. And so we wanted to try and improve the relationship the island has with those items, obviously principally through reduction, but if we can't, then through better waste management. And to do that, we have conducted a variety of engagement activities with multiple different actors on island to better improve our understanding of the importation, use, and waste disposal of single-use plastics. From that system mapping, we hope to identify those interventions, which are those opportunities to change, and then hopefully through the course of the project, implement some of them. To support this, we also wanted to investigate the environmental impact that plastic pollution is having on the environment, whether that's through local litter or from that international pollution that I mentioned earlier. And lastly, as this presentation has outlined, St. Helena faces, the same kind of problems that many small island states face. So through this project, we wish to establish what we're calling the UK Overseas Territories and Crown Dependencies Plastic Pollution Network. So essentially, that's a space to bring together people who are working in the plastic sphere to be able to share learnings and best practices that are happening across that network. And just to give you a couple of key achievements to date by the project. So of those interventions we identified, we're implementing 4 of them in the remaining capacity of the project. And they include a retailer pilot scheme to find sustainable alternatives for single-use plastics that they either sell or consume in their business operations. We're also performing an updated waste management options appraisal for a variety of waste streams, including plastics, to hopefully see whether there's any additional ways which we can move towards more circular economy practices for those waste streams, and also really identify the barriers for being able to make those changes. In addition, we're running education to improve waste segregation, which is being run alongside a new waste management service, which is being implemented by the St. Helena government. And hopefully we aim to see a greater segregation of those materials so that as and when those new waste management practices are implemented, the waste is being segregated for them. And lastly, we're aiming to address littering behavior that we see in the coastal environment. So whilst we obviously acknowledge there's a vast amount of international debris, we also want to make sure that the residents on the island are also minimizing their impact on the local environment. Just to give you an outline of one of the kind of key environmental studies which we're doing. So through the shoreline monitoring, which has been happening on St. Helena and Ascension, we've collected 1,200 odd bottles and 1,600 lids from across both islands. And because they are really data-rich items, you know, they have dates, manufacture dates, they have brands, they're really data-rich items, and we're hoping to use them to investigate the origins of some of those that international debris, which will be a really a great achievement for us. And lastly, with respect to the plastic network, so far we've held 3 group calls and are currently in the process of establishing a terms of reference so that group can kind of continue its ongoing collaboration beyond the duration of this Darwin-funded project. And lastly, just to kind of outline what the UN Global Plastics Treaty can do from St. Helena. We obviously want to see that the voices from the UK overseas territories, alongside obviously many other small island states around the world, are represented because we face unique and very difficult challenges. We also want to make sure that biodiversity is considered in the treaty because, again, like many small island states, we are home and responsible for internationally important biodiversity that is being affected by the plastic pollution. We also want to see that there are global standards for extended producer responsibility to empower small island states that are affected disproportionately by that waste, especially if we are starting to be able to identify where that waste is coming from. We also want to see, obviously, a global policy to cap and phase down virgin plastic production, specifically around single-use plastics, because obviously with those market barriers that I have outlined, we do need to see a kind of a top-down approach to some of these changes. We also wish to see a global market for recycled plastics, which will obviously better enable islands to hopefully move away from landfill and incineration waste management practices for plastics and move towards more circular economy practices. We would like to see a greater attention paid to waste management of ships in the high seas, simply because that is one of the areas which we believe is a great source of plastic pollution. And lastly, we'd like to see remediation of ocean plastics considered as well, especially for those small island states which have these kind of challenges with financing and being impacted by that international debris. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you'd like to know more or have any further questions, please follow up on that email address on the screen now.
Thank you so much for this insight of St. Helena, Tobias. And now it's my honor to pass the baton to Anna von Ribey. She is from the Ocean Vision legal and a legal advisor also for the Gallifrey Foundation, and she will give us some insight on the climate and ocean aspects. And I'm looking forward to listen to you on these obligations of states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, you, Karine, for this kind introduction, and thank you for having us on this panel today. My name is Dr. Anna van Reebe, and I'm the founder of Ocean Vision Legal, which is the first international law firm that is dedicated to the ocean protection. And today I am representing the Gallifrey Foundation. I'm going to share my screen here with you so that you can see my slides. Okay, so this year, one of the highest courts in international law, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, delivered a landmark advisory opinion, which was requested by the Commission of Small Island States. The so-called COTES advisory opinion is often referred to as the advisory opinion on the obligation of states under the law of the sea with regards to climate change. But what it actually really entails is an in-depth interpretation of what constitutes pollution of the marine environment and what the state's obligations are vis-à-vis this pollutions. So, today, we are going to investigate together what obligations arise for states under the COTES advisory opinion with regard to plastic pollution in the ocean. I'm not a scientist, and we have heard a fantastic presentation before by Falco and my other esteemed colleagues. And so I'm not going to go into it very deeply, but here are just a few brief remarks on the scientific background of marine plastic debris. So plastic pollution is one of the most severe threats to the marine environment today. By 2019, it contributed to 5% of global carbon emissions. The IUCN estimates that 14 million tons of plastic enter the ocean annually, representing 80% of all marine debris. Plastic enters the ocean through various sources, including land-based, vessels, and the atmosphere. It harms the marine environment significantly because marine life mistakes plastic for food and eats it, leading to starvation and suffocation, or they get entangled in the net. Bigger pieces of plastic break down into microplastics that accumulate in the marine food web, causing health problems also for humans. It contributes to ocean acidification and ultimately disrupts the biological carbon pump. So plastic pollution is so severe that it was even picked up in several United Nations General Assembly resolutions, highlighting, amongst others, the significant threat of plastic pollution to the environment, its detrimental effect on marine life and on humans, and highlighting the importance of adapting circular economy to reduce the production of plastic. So far, the scientific background. But now let's look at the law. So because the COTES advisory opinion was actually centered on pollution, and because plastic pollution is also a pollution in this understanding, the findings of the COTES advisory opinion completely apply to plastic pollution in the ocean. One of the key regulations that the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea used in order to find its advisory opinion was Article 194, paragraph 1 UNCLOS, that says, states shall take, individually or jointly as appropriate, all measures consistent with this convention that are necessary to prevent, reduce, and control marine environment pollution from any source. So let's take a little bit of a closer look on the specific elements of that. States are obliged to adopt necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution. So they must not only control marine pollution, but prevent and reduce it. This means that states are legally obliged to decrease plastic production. This is also reiterated in Article 194, paragraph 3, which provides example measures and stresses that measures shall be designed to minimize the release of toxic, harmful, or noxious substances, especially those which are persistent. These are also referred to as mitigation measures, and central to those measures is the reduction of pollution. Furthermore, the failure to do so incurs international liability. The ITLOS went on that the wording to take necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution does not oblige states to guarantee a specific result. Much more, states are obliged to make the best efforts to achieve these results, so it's an obligation of conduct. And what states specifically have to do is established by applying a due diligence on objective and science-based standards, and according to ITLAS, not just whatever states deem necessary. So, furthermore, the standard of due diligence must be more stringent the higher the risk of the pollution, particularly in cases of transboundary pollution. Well, plastic pollution is transboundary in nature as it is spread around the world by ocean currents, as we just saw with the St. Helene example. Furthermore, it has a high risk of causing severe and irreversible harm to the marine environment, but also to humans. So concludingly, the standard of a due diligence regarding what measures states have to adopt with regards to preventing, controlling, and reducing plastic pollution is very stringent. This due diligence must be based on the best scientific evidence. The ITLAS places specific weight on international regulations, resolutions, and guidelines, as they are adopted by a broad number of member states that provides them authoritative effect. We just saw the United Nations General Assembly resolutions that concluded that there is significant threat to the marine environment from plastic debris, and this detrimental effect on the marine life can even affect human health, and therefore it is important to adopt a circular economy to reduce the production of plastic. So concludingly, the resolutions inter alia from the United Nations General Assembly directly inform what measures states have to adopt. And deriving from that, states must adopt a circular economy to reduce the production of plastic. Whenever there is any uncertainty in the science, the precautionary principle has to be applied. This precautionary approach or principle is key to any due diligence evaluations. So states must address also potential risks to the marine environment, even without full scientific certainty. And again, failure to do so incurs international liability. The ITLAS goes on by defining what else defines the necessary measures. So it says that states must use the best practical means at their disposal, which may vary according to their availabilities and capabilities. At the same time, this may not justify neither postponement nor exemption from taking all necessary measures. Even more, states with capacity must provide technical assistance to other states with less availabilities and capabilities. The UNCLOS based its findings on further provisions of the ITLAS based its findings on further obligations under UNCLOS, one of them being Article 192 UNCLOS that says states have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. So according to ITLAS, preserving the marine environment means that there where the marine environment has been damaged, states are obliged to restore marine habitats in ecosystems. So states must take active measures to restore the marine environment from plastic pollution. Under Section 5 and 6 of Part 12 UNCLOS, states are obliged to adopt and enforce national legislations to prevent, reduce, and control pollutions, particularly where the private sector is involved. And states must engage to cooperate in formulating international rules for the protection and preservation of the marine environment. So, summarizingly, states must adopt and enforce laws that oblige to private companies to produce less plastic. And states are actually legally obliged to participate in conferences such as INC5. So that was a lot. Let's bring it all back together on this very last slide with 7 points. What does it mean? 1. States are obliged to adopt and enforce national laws to prevent, reduce, and control plastic pollutions, even from private companies. So states must adopt and enforce laws that oblige private companies to produce less plastic. States are obliged to participate in negotiations to adopt international rules to prevent, reduce, and control plastic pollutions. So state actually must participate in conferences such as INC5. Third, the obligation to prevent, reduce, and control plastic pollutions means that states are not only obliged to control plastic being flushed into the ocean, for example, through a circular economy, but also to decrease the production of plastic itself. 4. The failure to meet this obligation incurs international responsibilities. States can be taken to court and sued if they do not meet these criteria. 5th, the specific measures that states must take are established by applying due diligence based on objective scientific evidence. Because of the serious harm from plastic pollution and its transboundary nature, the standard of due diligence must be stringent. 6. Where there is any scientific uncertainty, the precautionary approach must be applied, taking into account potential risks. This means that where is no evidence, states must err on the side of caution. And lastly, where the marine environment has been damaged, states are obliged to restore it. So states must go out there and clean up the mess. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm very happy and looking forward to addressing some questions in the Q&A. And please feel free to reach out anytime to Ocean Vision Legal. And I'm very happy to hand over to the next speaker, Martina Müller from the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for passing me the floor, Anna, and it is a great pleasure to speak to this issue today. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm tuning in from New York today on behalf of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm happy to contribute to this important conversation today by speaking exactly to the connections between healthy biodiversity and disaster risk reduction, and how for this to be the case, we must end plastic pollution. Next slide, please. So I think to start, it is important to recognize that nature is, as described in the title of the slide, our first line of defense against many disasters. If we keep ecosystems healthy and conserve and sustainably use biodiversity, ecosystems can perform their functions and provide services, many different types of ecosystem services, right? But including services that help to mitigate hazards, to buffer disaster impacts, and to increase climate resilience. And this quote that you see on the screen, it's actually taken from a guidance document that UNDRR, so the office I work for, just launched to help governments strengthen the disaster risk reduction elements in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Considering that this connection between disaster risk reduction and biodiversity conservation is also recognized in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I welcome you all to take a look at the document. I will post the link in the chat after my presentation. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to drill down a little bit into the specific roles that ecosystems play in terms of disaster risk reduction, and then how plastic pollution is affecting that. So turning specifically to the interactions with plastic pollution, a few of the key functions that healthy ecosystems perform that help provide disaster risk reduction benefits. You can see some of these in the left column. So wetlands absorb excess water during floods, right? They play a crucial role in this balance in terms of preventing flooding. Corals, they act as a natural barrier, reducing, for example, wave energy and protecting shorelines. Here I say storm surges, but you can also think of tsunamis, hurricanes, other types of hazards that are coastal. Mangroves, similarly, they help stabilize coastlines. They absorb floodwaters, just like wetlands, and they reduce wind damages from storms. And seagrass beds, they help prevent erosion and they help trap sediment, so offering protection against coastal hazards as well. These are just a few examples of functions that can, and in many cases are already being affected by plastic pollution. So if you look to the to the right column, it is no secret that plastic pollution is a crucial stressor that poses a direct threat to biodiversity. I think we've heard just in this webinar today several mentions to different pieces of research and evidence pointing to that. And from our perspective, we are really concerned that significant and far-reaching and really permanent impacts on ecosystem resilience can be caused by plastic pollution, impairing essential services which ecosystems provide to humans, including in terms of disaster risk reduction. So, as actually mentioned by Falco a little bit earlier, research shows that accumulated plastic pollution is already harming wetlands, is already damaging coral reefs, is already impacting seagrass beds, and very worrisome, there's new research coming up that it is leading to the suffocation or can lead to the suffocation of mangrove plants. So this relationship is a very important one that we obviously want to avoid. We want to keep our ecosystems as healthy as possible, keep biodiversity thriving, also to prevent and to reduce disaster risk. We don't have the time during this short intervention, but if you'd like to take a further look at the research, I invite you to read the issues paper on the topic that we've prepared earlier this year. I will provide a QR code in a few slides and also post the link in the chat afterwards. And with this, we can move to the next slide. So I wanted to point out one thing that is really important to emphasize is that UN member states are already aware of the risks that degraded ecosystems cause, also in terms of disaster risk reduction. And the text that you see on the screen, it is from the political declaration of the midterm review of the Sendai framework. Now, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the Sendai framework, this is a 15-year agreement, so from 2015 to 2030, between United Nations member states to reduce the risk of disasters. It provides a roadmap for how we make our communities safer and more resilient. And this political declaration, it was adopted just last year here in New York by the General Assembly during the midterm review of the Sendai framework. So as you can see, it puts emphasis on the need to restore, preserve, and enhance ecosystem functions and services for the protection from natural hazards and to contribute to the increase in resilience and adaptive capacity of biodiversity and of ecosystems. So we see this as really important to continue having these discussions to ensure that the INC considers these elements while working towards an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Next slide, please. I'd like to use the last few minutes of my intervention to just give you an overview of how plastic pollution interacts with disaster risk. So this infographic that you see on the slide, it was developed by UNDRR to capture some of these elements and to demonstrate how they are all connected, often in a worrisome manner, right? There are feedback loops incorporated in there. So you can see here, for example, at the bottom, the reference to plastic waste deteriorating corals and marine ecosystems. A little bit further up, an important element that we emphasize is that this can including lead to an increase in vulnerability of people exposed to disasters. So here we're also speaking about their economic and social vulnerability, considering their reliance on marine biodiversity, further worsening often the impact of disasters. On the top, you see the impact it can have for example, in soil drainage capacity, which can be connected to increasing flooding, which can then also be connected to the mangrove, reduced capacity of mangroves, since, of course, a lot of the waterways, they end in mangrove forests before going into the ocean. And all these elements, unfortunately, they interact with each other. So just to give one further example, a storm surge or hurricane, for example, can lead to the leakage of even more plastic into the marine ecosystem, further worsening the problem. Now we can move to the next slide, please. I could continue talking about all these interactions for a while, but I will stop here. I just wanted to refer you to this issues paper, which contains a lot more of these details. And you can use the QR code. And it also contains a reproduction of the infographic I just showed, if you're interested in exploring this more. I also wanted to point out in particular 2 elements that we at UNDRR consider quite important. The first one is exactly this risk of plastic pollution leakage caused by disasters, and we are attentive to how member states would like to address that in the treaty. And the second one is the importance of resilient infrastructure, particularly of waste management systems, as we move forward regarding some of the downstream elements of the treaty. And here, when we talk about resilience, the definition of resilience that UNDRR uses, and it was also approved by the General Assembly through a resolution, is the ability of a system, a community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. And I think everyone on this webinar understands the crucial role that biodiversity plays towards that. And we're also releasing in a few weeks a material on reducing plastic pollution connected to disaster response or disaster relief efforts. These always often, unfortunately, also involve a lot of particularly single-use plastic. So I think we can stop the slides for now. Many thanks for your attention to this topic. Please feel free to reach out if you would like to discuss any of this further. And it is my pleasure to hand over the floor to Mr. Paul Lamin from the Environmental Protection Agency of Sierra Leone and the INC focal point for his country. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. And I also want to thank the IUCN and partners for inviting us to participate and give our view on the proposal for the inclusion of biodiversity aspects in the plastic treaty. So today, I'll be sharing the national views of Sierra Leone moving towards the INC 5 and the importance of nature-positive approaches and biodiversity in global plastic treaty. So my name is Paul Lamin from the Environment Protection Agency. Next slide, please. So let me just take this opportunity to give some baseline so that we get to understand the nature of the plastic pollution problem in Sierra Leone. So in 2019, it was estimated that about $140 million, or the equivalent of 130,000 tons of plastic, is being imported into the domestic market in Sierra Leone. So out of that 130,000 tons, only about 10% of the plastic product is used. Plastic product used are produced locally. So all of the rest are being, including the single-use plastic, are imported from outside. And also the recycling facilities or industries is also at the infant stage. We're only having very few recycling companies coming up, and even with that, they're not able to deal with the problem we're having in terms of plastic waste. So imagine that we are only able to recycle about 7,200 tons of plastic waste out of the 130,000 tons. So in 2021 and 2022, we did a baseline study on the plastic beach litter, and we did that together with Grid Arenda from Norway. So that study shows that we have up to 70%, of litter constituting plastic by count, and also about the plastic consumed to 49% by weight. So that shows the gravity of the situation. Next slide, please. So with that, they also need to provide some information on the challenges to managing plastic in Sierra Leone. In Sierra Leone currently, there are a lot more problems, dealing with plastic. First of all, the plastic waste management is a problem. We do not have engineered landfills, and also the sustainable consumption patterns, is not regarded in any sector at all. Next slide, please. And there's also the demand for single-use plastic is also another issue, because we have a problem with potable or safe drinking water. So people now rely on bottled water or sachet water, for drinking in their homes. So even the water supplied by the ministry, the water sector, that one people do not have faith in it. People do not use it for drinking purposes. So now we have multiple companies, producing water. So all of this is actually escalating the problem of plastics. Next slide, please. So I move over to the national views moving toward INC 5. So this is actually based on some of the discussions, interactions we have had with people from various backgrounds. And this does actually present a Sierra Leone position at this moment. It's just a kind of informal discussion sometimes we used to have during our engagement meetings. So many people are saying that there is need for a comprehensive approach in the plastic treaty, where the treaty can focus not only on the downstream measures, but the entire life cycle of plastic. And also the idea of balancing the plastic dependency and public demand. So you hear NGOs advocating, they are campaigning, ban plastic, let's advocate, let's make our voices heard at the international forum, ensuring that there is a complete ban, but not realizing how dependent Sierra Leone is on plastic. So these are some of the views. Then there's also a trade concerns. We have now many companies which are involved in the plastic trade. So we also think that since there are no alternatives at this moment, so people think that will also create some amount of problems, in the market, and also the availability of those essential goods, made out of plastics. Next slide. So there's also a consideration, for support to low-income countries like Sierra Leone. So because most of the time, when government, when they are doing projects, they have to actually look at those priority things, So we always need support to be able to implement the treaty, and also to be able to prioritize critical issues like what is happening right now. So people are thinking that, okay, let's deal with the most harmful or hazardous chemicals, in those plastic products, and forget about the other ones that are less toxic. And also the implementation success also depend on financial resources, technology, and capacity building, and also the financial mechanism that will make a kind of minimize barriers. Most times in the countries like mine, we suffer from those bureaucratic procedures. Next, I think this is the last slide. And now the importance of nature positive approaches and biodiversity in the plastic treaty. So I also want to join my colleagues, the previous speakers, to emphasize that there is actually a need to align the plastic biodiversity with the plastic treaty, because this also can complement a lot of gaps. And for instance, we have the Sierra Leone is a party to the Ramsar Convention. We signed it and we were able to designate about 295,000 hectares of wetlands, as Ramsar sites. But guess what? So over time, that area has shrunk because of human encroachment. But oftentimes, government is not actually focusing on some other issues. They just focus on the encroachment, the infrastructural development, things like that, and they're forgetting the waste, the waste the plastic is causing. Just like the previous speaker mentioned, the impact of plastic in wetland areas. So we also think that this can complement other frameworks, like we talk about the lost and abandoned fishing gears. In the picture here, you can see that's monofilament. So this net has been banned in Sierra Leone, but still we have it coming through the illegal means. So by way of introducing the biodiversity aspect into the plastic treaty, we think this can actually curtail some of these issues. Then also, we think it can also enhance ecosystem resilience. And so the Abidjan Convention, there's a protocol which requires state members to address pollution from land-based sources and activities. So there's also a great synergy, between this regional treaty and the future international plastic treaty. And also it can promote socio-economic benefits in terms of fisheries and tourism. I think this has also been emphasized. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions or remarks, I'll be here, to respond to that. So with that, let me now hand over to Mr. Matthew Culloch, Program Lead for the Aquatic Species and Policy Conservation Programs at the Zoological Society of London, to moderate the Q&A session. Over to you, Mr. Culloch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to all the speakers, especially for staying bang on time. That's always very appreciated. It makes my job easier. I think that was a really lovely sort of breadth of how plastics impact biodiversity, but also how the treaty the importance of including biodiversity in the treaty for nature, but clearly also for communities and humanity more broadly. I would say that we're lucky enough to have Neil Thorpe joining us from the St. Helena National Trust. We had a recorded presentation from Tobias, but we do have representation from St. Helena for the Q&A, which is great. So there was a question that came into the Q&A box, which Falco has answered, but I do think it's quite a good one for us to discuss as a panel, because I think Paul just touched on there on the point around alternatives. Someone raised in the question in the Q&A around the need for alternatives to plastic, but also that these might have impacts that will mimic plastics or that are additional. Falco has given an answer. I don't know if you want to just maybe give a quick sort of summary of that, Falco, but it'd be interesting to see if anyone else has any sort of thoughts on how we use alternatives in the context of plastics.
Yeah, thanks for that, Leading. Yeah, it was a good question. So basically the question was, yeah, what have we looked into alternative materials impact on biodiversity? And I think what I tried to kind of answer in my question is that as an organization, we did look into, let's say, plastic alternative. What an ordinary plastic alternative is other type of plastic, like bio-based plastic, what people also often refer as like biodegradable plastics. And from our report, I mean, if I just want to like highlight that conclusion briefly, was that there is no silver bullets at the moment in terms of like alternative plastic, and there is quite a lot of, let's say, attention around it, and we should be cautious on it, like making sure that any alternatives, so in terms of these plastics, but also non-plastic material I mentioned, like paper, steel, that basically a life cycle approach is taken in order to assess, let's say, potential long-run impact of these materials. And this is something that we have been working on with teams, like with our regional teams and partners at Fauna&Flora. Like there are some that are keen in exploring, let's say, new materials, like going back, let's say, to basics elements. Like we have team looking at, for example, looking at like banana leaves, using banana leaves instead of single-use plates. I mean, going back to these kind of very basic solutions sometimes could be a clear, let's say, path forward in certain like very specific cases. But yeah, just wanted to highlight that, yeah, like our kind of recommendation on the treaty perspective on that aspect of like alternative material is that any kind of material that is explored or looked into should really kind of be assessed thoroughly and holistically, just to ensure that we avoid any unintended consequences on communities and biodiversity on the long run. But yeah, I'll leave that for the others to expand on this if they wish to.
Thanks, Falco. Does anyone else have any perspectives on this?
I think just to jump in quickly and point out that what Falco just said really highlights the need to have a cross-sectional understanding of where biodiversity fits in with plastic pollution and with the ILBI, and then also to empower the future COPs and the future Secretariat activities potentially to be under the ILBI, to be able to coordinate and also to generate more information on biodiversity, et cetera. This really does show that our understanding of plastics obviously is quite evolving and quite nuanced. And will become even more so when we're talking about alternatives and substitutes as well. So when we think about including those under the treaty and we think about how those might look in annexes, et cetera, it's also very important that we do keep this very strong place for biodiversity intersections so much within the treaty, so that we can also address how substitutes and alternatives could be included in the plastics discussion, rather than always having to think of, for example, a new treaty on something else, rather than just keeping it under the rubric of the existing MEA framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. Any further thoughts from the panel? There's been a flurry of activity in the Q&A, so if not, I can move on. Okay, so we have a question here, which I think, again, is very pertinent, particularly from the case study from St. Helena, which is that obviously the Plastics Treaty is sort of addressing sort of things that happen in the future, but what can it do to sort of deal with the existing plastics, particularly that we're seeing in the ocean, things that are already out there, the sort of cleanup of this? So I guess, yeah, over to the panel as to how we deal with this issue through the treaty.
Maybe I can chime in on this.
Martina, please.
Yes, of course, member states are discussing what to do with so-called legacy plastic, right? Like plastic that is already in the environment, particularly specific hotspots. From UNDRR's perspective, we have communicated this to member states, that it would be also important to consider which let's say, hotspots of accumulation of plastic pollution are the most critical to address in a priority sense. Just considering that we know, for example, how specific accumulation of plastic pollution in certain areas is leading to an increase in disasters. I think the most referred to is flooding, right? So that is related to accumulation of plastic pollution in urban areas, but also in rural areas, in waterways, clogging drainage, and all of that. And some research that was actually carried out by Lucy Tanner and her team. I think she was on the call earlier today. They detected that at least 200 million people are already being exposed to flooding that has been aggravated by plastic pollution. So these types of considerations would be very important for member states to take them into account when deciding on how to deal with so-called legacy plastic pollution.
Thank you, Martina. Karina, I can see you've got your hand up, and then Falco.
Yes, very briefly, I think the negotiators and countries are well aware of this, that this is a huge problem, and to also address in parallel with within the means of implementation of the future treaty. And so it showed up also when we discussed on financing and the need for financing. And I think within the plastics treaty, this will be also addressed on that part, on the financing part, and not only on financial mechanism, but also on private sector involvement and partnerships with the private sector in order to address legacy plastic.
Thanks, Karine. Falco, over to you.
Yeah, no, I just want to say I fully support what both Karine has said, and I think it's just something to add on this, and something that we've been seeing, like working with our teams, but also like looking at the work that scientists are doing on this, is that whatever kind of, let's say, measure comes out from the treaty on this aspect, what we have to make sure is also that we ensure that when we tackle legacy plastic, that it is locally appropriate and done in an ecologically sensitive way, so that we can prevent really further harm to biodiversity and communities that are most at risk. So I would just say, yeah, like looking really at what's out there and take learnings, let's say, from all the work that has been done, and from the science, which there is quite a lot out there.
Thank you. Any further reflections? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question.
I was just going to sort of reaffirm exactly what Falco was saying there. And as you mentioned, Matt, from St. Helena's point of view, obviously we have a majority of plastic which is arriving on the island is coming from alternative sources, and being able to finance that, because money is critical on the island, and being able to sort of have that as part of the plastic treaty is really, really important. So yeah, thank you, Karine, for that.
Thanks, Neil. The next question is sort of quite a sort of back to basics one. What are the risks of having ambiguous or no references to biodiversity in the treaty?
Right, I will happily jump in for that.
I
know, it's not really, truly. So certainly the risk of having no reference is that we then have very little, if any, strong legal support for including biodiversity in the future actions of the conferences of the parties, including things like directions on what might go into annexes, what might go into future work plans, what might go into future reporting requirements, etc. And also the idea that by limiting biodiversity references, we would limit some of the ability of both the Conference of the Parties itself, as well as the Secretariat, to be authorized to work with other very relevant MEAs like the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also even like the Convention on Migratory Species and some aspects of the chemicals and pollution treaties that we have in the BRS system, for issues that are overlapping between biodiversity and chemicals or pollution or migratory species and plastics. So leaving out that element really does create a very big gap for how we envision the treaty moving forward. And when we think of the treaty and we think of the idea of ending plastic pollution, or reducing and then ultimately ending plastic pollution, as was set out in the terms of the UNEA resolution, we think about it for human health, but we also think about it for the purposes of biodiversity. So taking out that option really does limit a great deal of the potential application of the treaty itself for people, but also for biodiversity, but also for people, and also for the communities that would be served by having this nexus between protecting biodiversity and the ecological resources and ecosystems that it encompasses, and protecting their own livelihoods and their own knowledge base. So it really is quite fundamental to many aspects of the treaty. I think just the ambiguity language also is important to highlight, in that anytime we have legal ambiguity, there is always the option that it can be interpreted in a way that is negative, and that, for example, wouldn't include biodiversity, or wouldn't include ecosystems, or wouldn't include certain aspects that are critical to understanding biodiversity and the relationship it has with plastics, especially with plastic pollution. So the risk of ambiguity is obviously quite high, and that also does tend to be a problem as well. I hope that was it. If anyone, if Karine or anyone else wants to jump in, please do.
Karine.
Just a final remark, because at the end it will be on country level, on national level, and especially also on local level that a future treaty must be implemented. And those local and national levels are facing actually many challenges also with regard to other MEA obligations and reporting and monitoring systems. So future national action plans under the implementation of a plastics treaty must be aware that there is, under the Biodiversity Convention, also an obligation on reporting. And so in order not to overburden and to operate in silos on a national and local level, I think it will be important to address biodiversity as a cross-cutting issue in a new MEA like the Global Plastic Treaty.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that it's very relevant outside of just this treaty. We have a few minutes left before I wrap up. There's a very big question, which is probably not the best one to end with, because there's a lot of discussion, but there's a question posed around the increased participation of business and finance sectors in the INCs, and how do the panel think this will impact those biodiversity asks for the treaty? As I say, that's a very big question, but if anyone can maybe respond in a couple of minutes, that would be great. And good luck.
So I would perhaps jump in, because we just hosted the IUCN Leaders Forum last week, and nature positiveness on nature-based solutions, I think, arrived also in the arena of finance and business. And so we also see that we have a business coalition that is supporting an outcome, I would say, of the Global Plastic Treaty. In that sense, I would say I want to be positive, because nature positiveness is not only a greenwashing etiquette, but business and industry, and especially also the finance sector, has to be taken in account, or in responsibility, what they have promised with a sustainable finance plans that they have advanced. And businesses also, they are building their business on a healthy biodiversity, and not on a biodiversity that is in loss and it's collapsing. So we have to be positive, but happy to listen to other people.
Thank you, Karine. Any final perspectives?
I think, just to jump in on that quickly, we also have to remember that many of the reporting requirements that will be coming in will also impact on businesses. So when we think of what the reporting requirements might look like for the future ILBI, this is something that will include, obviously, a great deal of public sector work across all levels, international, national, and local, but it also will include the business sectors. And so this is a positive thing as well, and it's a positive potential place for there to start to be much more of a nexus and a dialogue about how that fits in. So it can indeed, I think, to echo Karine, maybe it's us being both positive because we work together so much and we have many of the same thoughts, but there is a potential for this to be quite positive, and to then be an outcome, especially for biodiversity. If there is that language in the treaty, if it remains, then we really could see a very powerful force for biodiversity and working together with both private actors as well as public actors.
Thank you. And that's excellent words to end on as we've just reached the end. So I'd just like to wrap up by saying thank you so much to all the speakers and to Neil for joining the Q&A, to colleagues at IUCN and Fauna&Flora who were sort of integral in developing this, Diana from the GEN who made this all happen, and to you, the audience, for joining and for listening to this, for being part of it, and for providing the questions. So thank you to everyone again, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So thank you also on our behalf to all the panelists, but also to all the attendees who joined us today and those who will later watch the video of this event. I am jumping here to announce upcoming events. And before I do that, I also want to thank all those who work behind the scenes and that we forget many times to mention at the end of our events. So just bringing here to your attention that in this we will have a few more events in the Road to Busan series that we are hosting in the run-up to the INC 5 session. We have 2 dates already confirmed, which are not next week, but the following week. 2 sessions that you can see now here on the screen on the 29 and the 30 of October. And we have a few more coming up in early November. So we look forward to see you at these events. I think the links have also been shared in the chat. And you see on this slide also a few other events that could be of interest for this community that we are organizing with the Global Framework on Chemicals, or with the team that is leading the negotiation on a science policy platform to address chemicals waste and pollution. So with that, it's time to say goodbye to everybody and remind those who are interested to rewatch the video, that the video will be available on the webpage of the event, as well as the links that have been mentioned. And don't forget to download the document that has been prepared by today's speakers. You can see here, like we have the slide with the QR code to download the document, and the link has also been shared in the chat. So with that, goodbye to all, and looking forward to see you at one of the upcoming events. And good luck for everybody fighting to have biodiversity into this treaty.